This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Good writers create, the best writers steal.
Wizards of the Coast says it didn't mean to send a DMCA takedown notice.
Need to be reined in a bit.
We didn't mean for you to get mad at us about it.
One's got fired from a job for being bad at math.
Shadow Dark is not so different from old school D&D.
Oh, I'm going to squish me that frog.
The question is, any advice for people who want to GM but are afraid of math?
The artificer, as we've described previously, is a balloon animal artist.
Should minions of the big, bad, evil monster notice and therefore react when they used repeatedly putting them in harm's way and making them disposable?
All that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms, also the #1 board game, wargaming, and card game podcast in all the realms, if you didn't know. Well, we experimented with that early on, but the other three didn't seem all that interested in those other topics. So largely we've ended up skipping them. Until today, I'm Ben Byrne, by the way, if you've never watched this before, joined by Shawn Merwin, James Hake, Dale Kingsmill out this week. So Shawn, I'm going to ask you, of the tabletop Venn diagram, the four circles, it's not really a trinity, but you know what I mean, of role-playing games, card games, board games, war games, where do you sit, do you think, on that Venn diagram?
I sat firmly in the conjunction of tabletop role-playing games and board games.
Okay.
If you're talking about card games, if you just mean like playing cards, then I would be in that as well. If you're talking about collectible card games, that ship sailed for me long, long ago because I am hopelessly, helplessly working class. And I will not buy something that requires me to then buy something else. So collectible card games, mini games where I have to buy stuff and then buy paint and then buy other stuff I buy a set of books, I buy a board game, and I play the bejesus out of those. And I will buy other things, but as soon as there's a collectible element or you got to keep buying, you've lost me.
Would you ever, and not to add to my own Venn diagram, would you ever consider a living card game, I believe they're called, which is kind of, it's board game-esque. The idea is that you buy one box, you've got the entire game that you need to play, but then you can buy boxed expansions as opposed to boosters.
Dominion, love it. Yeah,
Gotcha.
Love those card games. But again, I need to be able to play that whole game, and understanding that there may be boosters that I don't need to buy or new additions I don't need to buy. But no, that's it.
Well, let me tell you about a great game that's coming called Gwent, no, I'm just kidding. This is not an ad spot for the Gwent card game. James Hake, how about you? Where do you sit on that Venn diagram?
Oh, well, I'm firmly in the RPG camp. I love strategy games. Like war games, but I typically play them as video games more than I do as tabletop experiences because, much like Shawn, I don't have it in me to collect and paint huge armies. I've been invited to play Necromunda a couple of times, which is much easier, much more manageable on the collecting figures front. And I haven't done it yet, but I'm sorely tempted to. One of my old housemate, the guy who got me into D&D years ago, is really into Necromunda right now, and they're this close to convincing me to get an army and play.
Oh, you could have a career in Games Workshop before you know it.
Yeah.
How about you, Ben?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm kind of, not on the outer by any stretch, but I feel like the Venn diagram that, as described, is less kind of constricted than I think folks who sit in some of the connecting points might assume. Because I sit in the section firmly with wargaming, RPG, board gaming, and not always at the same time throughout my sort of tabletop hobby career, but at the moment, kind of very much at the same time, sitting in all three of those camps. I've just gotten into Kill Team, which is very kind of skirmish, not too dissimilar from Necromunda. Painting up my little towel. But yeah, I think that I had assumed that a lot more people would be into the miniatures and the wargaming kind of side of things than they necessarily are in the RPG industry. And the flip side of that is also true, where you talk to a lot of wargamers and they have no clue how D&D is meant to be played or similar RPGs. They're like, what? But what do you mean you don't need miniatures? Like, how do you know where you are on the battlefield or whatever, So the misunderstanding between those two communities as someone who sits firmly in the middle never surprises to amaze me.
It's interesting that you bring up Venn diagrams because I played a Venn diagram game, a board game this weekend.
Oh.
It's called Things in Rings.
Okay.
And the game is literally trying to figure out where these items fit in a Venn diagram. One person plays like the seer, and they know what these 3 circles mean.
Sure.
And so people play cards, and then the seer goes, well, no, this is here. And they try to figure out what each of the circles of the Venn diagram mean.
It's kind of like Mysterium plus NYT Connections.
A bit. Yeah. Play it with your family. It's got a Doctor Seuss-esque feel. Because the cards are illustrated, but with a Seuss-like whimsy. But it's a really fun sort of deductive game. So Things in Rings out there, folks. If you're big fans of Venn diagrams and logic and want to teach your kids or play with your friends.
We're going to jump into only a little bit of news this week. I'm going to try and do this first one that Dale literally just sent us from Beyond the Realm. So I'm literally reading this headline for the first time. I have a vague idea of what this is about. This is breaking news. This comes from PC Gamer. Wizards of the Coast says it didn't mean to send a DMCA takedown notice to a Baldur's Gate 3 Stardew Valley mod. We are now in the process of fixing that. By the looks of it, basically somebody made a mod for Stardew Valley, which is a farming simulator game, if you're not familiar, where it appears, and I'm just going off screenshots as I scroll this article, you could play as a Starian in Stardew Valley. If you ever wanted your vampire man to wander around and collect shells, I think that's what you do in Stardew Valley, you can do that now via this mod. Except, Wizards of the Coast DMCA'd it, which means that they were like, you can't have our IP in your mod, grr. And then the Baldur's Gate man, Sven, was like, but this is such a show of love. Why would you DMCA that? And now Wizards have said, according to this headline, soz, our bad. We didn't mean to do that. We're going to reverse that decision. Is that a pretty good summary?
We didn't mean for you to get mad at us about it.
Yeah, probably true.
Every big organization has the lawyer crew over there, and they do the lawyer crew things. And they sometimes get a little excited and need to be
This is not an issue unique to Wizards of the Coast. A lot of fan work, even free fan work, gets taken down. Nintendo is famous for litigating fan remakes of their games, fan mods of their games. And I still love Nintendo, even if they're famously litigious. So hopefully this is water up the duck's back.
I feel the same. Games Workshop. I mean, it's disappointing when it does happen. I believe, and I'm not fully across this story, but Astartes was like this very high quality CGI Space Marine fan TV show, I guess, that was being published on YouTube in like 2-minute clips.
Oh, I remember that.
And then if you played them all together, yeah. I think that initially got taken down by GW, and then they ended up either purchasing it or hiring the guys who made it. I can't quite remember. Sound off in the comments. Let me know if I'm wrong. But yeah, this stuff happens. Like, it's a knee-jerk reaction to defending IP that IP law, I believe, deems necessary in some capacity, that you have to defend your IPs to keep ownership of them. But when something is clearly fan-made, it's disappointing when it's been taken down if there's no obvious nefarious reason behind it. So yeah, I don't know. It sounds like the mod's back up. People can correct us because this, like I said, I'm literally reading this headline for the first time right now. It's the passing of Paul Sawyer. If that name's not immediately familiar to you, Paul Sawyer was the editor-in-chief of White Dwarf magazine, which is Games Workshop's Warhammer magazine, from 1993 to 2007. I bring this up mainly because, when I heard this news, really scratched a memory at the back of my brain, because that was my prime White Dwarf reading years between 1993 and 2007. I remember Paul Sawyer in a lot of issues. I remember there were, specific battle reports with Paul and the staff of White Dwarf back then, and Games Workshop. So, and then Paul went on, of course, to co-found Warlord Games in 2007, which is best known for Bolt Action, and they're a miniature wargaming company as well that specialize more in historic games. Sad passing of Paul Sawyer for someone who had certainly some impact on my hobby journey. What is our email address if people want to reach out to us and send in an email?
Yes.
Oh, this is a hard one. Let me think. Oh, wait. Is it podcast@ghostfiregaming.com?
It is podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. And that is where Zach, the emailer who emailed last week, well, actually emailed a few weeks ago, but we didn't take the email last week because we ran out of time. But we're going to take it this week. So for those who have been waiting on tenterhooks, this is Zach's email. How to write or design adventures for greedy, self-interested characters. How to hook the players when the characters aren't motivated by something such as the common good. And Zach went to efforts to emphasize that the chaotic playstyle of the group isn't the problem itself. It's not that he has unwilling players. It's that they want to engage in a campaign where everybody has agreed to be selfish, conniving. Not quite an evil campaign. That's not quite the vibe I'm getting. Just a self-interested campaign.
You ever read the book series Black Company?
I have not, no.
I forget the name of the author. It was really popular when I was in high school. But it's about basically a group of dark fantasy mercenaries who aren't really that interested in the greater good. They aren't really that interested in heroism, but they will do what it takes to survive and thrive in a pretty rough and tumble world. And it's been a while since I've read those books. Hopefully that's a good summary of what's going on there. One example is read that kind of fiction, right? Steal plot hooks from that kind of fiction. Good writers create, the best writers steal, especially when you're not going to go reselling it. You're just going to share it for your home D&D group?
It's a really great question, really long, very explicit email. Not explicit in terms of
yeah.
But at the end, Zach gave this, which I hear a lot, and I laugh every time I hear it. And it's not about communicating with my players. We've communicated, so don't tell me to communicate with my players, but I need actionable advice. And my actionable advice is communicate with your players.
Got him. Boom.
Because, yes, you have agreed that it's great to play these characters. You have agreed that we're going to be the selfish group. We're going to be the people that only do things when it benefits us. But if they are not taking your plot hooks, even though you are offering things that you think a greedy character would accept, then the problem is communicating with your players. And I know people hate that answer, but there is nothing that communicating can't fix. Now, maybe the communication will prove to you that it is unfixable, and then you can change things completely. But there's nothing that communication can't stop. So here's what you say to your players. This thing is happening in town. We need someone to investigate. No. Okay, we will give you 100 gold pieces. It's still too dangerous. Okay, we will give you 200 gold pieces. No, it's still too dangerous. At this point, what do players want? What do their characters want? The only one who can answer that question are the players. So you say to the players, I'm trying here. What will motivate your character? Everyone, give me a list of 3 things that motivates your particular character. And now I will use those things and we will tell amazing stories together. Simple communication gets the point across. We're all good to go. Now, we can talk in general about ways to motivate any sorts of characters. But one other thing, Ben, that you didn't mention here, that this wasn't a D&D game.
Right.
What game was it?
Was it Shadow Dark? I'm remembering the email off the top of my head.
It's Shadow Dark. Let's go to the Shadow Dark text, because there's a section on adventure hooks. And it says, there are 3 things that will motivate your players in this game. Rewards. Players want more treasure and XP to make their character stronger. 2, heroism. Players want to right wrongs, save the day, and make a name for their characters. 3, discovery. Much like solving a mystery, players want to know why a problem or location exists and what secrets it hides. So go to the game that you're playing and see what the game tells you should be motivating. And if that's not helping your play, then you need to change the way you play, change the game, change the system, change something. So that's my short answer. And now you can tell why I wanted to wait and not answer it last week when we had 3 minutes.
I've got a good follow up to this, I think, because I agree with Shawn that, asking, hey, what do you guys even want is a great place to start. I also think that the way in which you ask that question can help get you the information you need. Asking directly in an out of character way can be very useful. But some players, especially players who like to feel immersed as the character in their world, kind of resent this sometimes. You know, these different philosophies to how you play a game. There are some people who like to kind of, you know, they love getting into character, but they also love to kind of float above the character a little bit and have this directorial view of what's going on. How would I write my character? Right? That sort of thing. And so they like to think about the active motivating forces for their character, while others just like to get into the headspace and just sort of feel it out, right? And that's to say nothing of the other side of the spectrum entirely, which is I don't think about what my character wants at all. Even, you know, whether it's in their head or whether it's out of their head, I just want to play the game. And if it doesn't feel right to me, the player, not the character, you know, the character's mind and my mind, motivation wise, are aligned. And I want to get money, or I want such and such and such and such. I'm going to set that one aside for now, because I can't give much good advice on that. But one thing that the Daggerheart system does really well is create character hooks in a somewhat oblique way. It sounds like this person doesn't really want to sit down and have a direct conversation about, so what the hell do you guys want? And that's fine. I think that way is best, but I'm sure that my opinion is not universally correct. One thing the Daggerheart character sheet does, and it does it for all of its classes, it has different questions for all of its classes, is it has two sections called background questions and connections. And background questions are things you answer about your character, and they're very directed. They're leading questions that are intended for, in the process of the character, the player answering them, giving the GM actionable nouns for them to use in their game. Here's the rogue. And right, Daggerheart classes often align really well with D&D classes, or the sort of character archetypes that you find in any sort of fantasy game, Shadow Dark included. Here's one question. What did you get caught doing that had you exiled from your community? You used to have a different life, but you've tried to leave it behind you. Who from that time is still chasing you? Who is still chasing you? And then who from that other life were you most sad to say goodbye to? Right? These are sort of touchy-feely, narrative-y questions. But if the characters are hard to motivate with a money danger proposition, you might be able to lure them by appealing to the hearts of those characters. Right? What's worth more than money? Family, or a best friend, an ally, a blood brother. What would you do anything for, no matter how high the cost is? Someone who's desperately important to you. And those are sort of questions that motivate really great fantasy novels, I find, more often than not. You can do other things, other highfalutin concepts. You know, why does Aragorn go on the quest of the ring? Well, he cares about the throne of Gondor. I'm talking about Aragorn in the books, by the way. Aragorn in the movies is less motivated by this. He's sort of muddier as a character. More interesting, but muddier. Book Aragorn is, I am the rightful king of the throne of Gondor, and I will do what kings do. And so, hey, if you've got a character who must do what their ideal drives them to do, then that's a great hook. Well, this is a way to advance your ideal. Yeah, think of things that go beyond money and drag them in that way.
That's why the game itself means a lot to this question, because you were talking about Daggerheart. Fate does something similar in that your aspects are supposed to introduce not just who you are, but what your relationships are, what your trouble is. D&D has tried to do that in the past with its backgrounds and its flaws and so on. But Shadow Dark is a game that doesn't do it, specifically doesn't give you that big background. It's like you do have a background, but it's more like you were an urchin and there's like one line and that's it. So if any game sort of expects you to just go to the dungeon and do the thing, it's that game. If the players want to play Shadow Dark, they should play Shadow Dark. And
gotcha.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting
no, I really dig this response, Shawn. People ask all the time about, what the difference between one game or another is. And it's this stuff. It's the stuff that surrounds the fantasy. Because Shadow Dark is not so different from old school D&D. It might be a bit streamlined and stuff like that, but old school D&D is filled with, we'll call them unintentional choices. Shadow Dark has made some very distinctive choices. And I think a great thing about modern gaming, whether it's deliberately old school or deliberately new school or somewhere in between, is that they make a lot of deliberate choices to guide the style of play. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that aspect.
And now there have been additions to the game, and there's a whole community that creates stuff for it. And there's a Kickstarter going on right now for it that's doing well. That's adding to the game, but the game itself just expects you to take your torch, go into the dungeon, and cross your fingers.
Yeah,
because that's you're more likely than not coming out. And the XP itself is tied to treasure, not to killing monsters. Not to do anything else. It's the money you get is the XP you get. Now you can get boons from XP from the boons you might get, but even that's sort of tied to rewards. So the only way you're leveling is by going out and doing the things that gets you the treasure. So it's an odd match of player type style with game.
I think I agree, because when I thought of this question, I thought of the way that I like to run a lot of games, take a lot of inspiration from series like Game of Thrones, but also more recently the Saxon stories or the Saxon Chronicles turned into the TV show The Last Kingdom, if people are more familiar with that, where you don't really have questing heroes in those stories, Robb Stark is not a questing hero. He's a king of the North with responsibilities and fallibilities. Uhtred is not a questing hero. He's someone who is thrust into roles of responsibility, and he's really just trying to get what's his, aware of the dangers that kind of confront him at any one time. And that kind of, to me, sounds like the sort of characters that Zach is playing with, if not just outwardly greedy evil characters. But the problem with those sort of quests is that you need to come up with a really strong reason, as Shawn was saying. If the system wants you to get them into the dungeon, to delve the dungeon, what is the reason that Uhtred of Bebbanburg, who never goes dungeon delving, as far as I can remember in any of the books, would go dungeon delving, right? Is it to get some treasure that's going to keep the kingdom safe? Because if he does, he doesn't care about the kingdom, but he does live in it, so he has to keep it safe to stop, something bad from happening. Or will it bring honor? If we bring this treasure, we don't care about this treasure that's in the dungeon, but if we bring it out, the king will give us land, and we want that land, because we want to raise our sons and daughters and da-da-da-da-da. Finding those selfish reasons to get them to do what the game wants them to do.
I like that Ben, I really like that you've kind of put the onus of responsibility for engaging in the adventure on the players here. I think so much game advice on the internet is directed squarely into the mind of the game master. And it's good. The game mastering is a very hard job, and it's a very particular job. And it's good that there's a lot of advice out there on how to do it. But I do think there is an issue where players are not given or expected to do that level of thought about what they do. And, this might be an issue of supply and demand, right? It's not like we're flush with game masters looking for only the cream of the crop players here, where it seems like the other way around can be true. We talk about the Mercer effect, which I don't believe is true, but people have it in their mind that the GM needs to be perfect sometimes. I think it's totally okay, especially if there's an expectation that the GM be really, really good at what they do. The GM to say, hey, I need you to make characters that fit what we're doing here. I need you to make a bunch of absolute weirdos who are okay risking their lives for a handful of gold. This is a world in which people have to risk their lives for a handful of gold. That's the genre we're making here in Shadow Dark. So if your character thinks you're too good for, dying in a swamp over 100 GP, that character's in the wrong story.
And there are ways to bring the story to the characters, but then you get into complaints about railroading or complaints about taking away player agency. Because if they're not going to the dungeon, what do you have to do? You have to bring the dungeon to them, right? You have to bring the threat and put it right directly in front of the players. And then again, you get these claims that, well, we didn't have a choice because we didn't go to the swamp to fight the lizard folk. The lizard folk came to us and we just had to fight our way out. It's one way or another. How do you want it delivered? Do you want it served, hot, or do you want it served cold? Mark's Mayhems. And it's a question about, of all things, math. First, Marks asks, can we ask a question on YouTube? I have a feeling you probably did, and we are answering it. So the answer is yes. And the question is, any advice for people who want to GM but are afraid of math? Or folks who want to GM because they love storytelling but are intimidated by game mechanics?
Love storytelling, intimidated by game mechanics. Well, first of all, there are plenty of games out there that don't involve dice and math and stuff like that. There are games that are more about cards and effects. There are games that are GM-less or diceless. Amber diceless role-playing is a favorite of Matthew Mercer from back in the day. Yeah. Wanderhome has been mentioned in the chat. The Quiet Year, a favorite of mine. Scarlet Mont says, intimidated by mechanics. Daggerheart, I don't know about that. Daggerheart's got a lot of mechanics, even if they are somewhat more narratively oriented. There's definitely some math in that game, but there are absolutely RPGs out there. We've listed some. Amber's a bit rare these days. You might have a bit of trouble getting a group together for that one. The Quiet Year has given me some of the most emotional RPG moments of my gaming lifetime. Oh, and while Daggerheart might not be what I would suggest, Spencer Stark's first big game, Alice is Missing, is a great low math role-playing game.
Yep. If you're a Luddite, though, do not play that game because it's about texting.
Yes.
And you actually text the entire game. So bring your good cell phone plan with it.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to differentiate here between math and between mechanics. Because there is a difference. Having worked with folks who have math anxiety, not just have math anxiety, but have had full-on math arithmophobia or numerophobia, it's a real thing, and we understand that. So the question that I come back with is, how bad is it? Is it like you literally start shaking when you see numbers? Because you can buy dice that have the words instead of the numbers. You could, if you need to avoid math entirely, then switch to a game that has literally no math. If it's just that you're slow with adding, if you have that sort of fear of having to do large or small amounts of math in front of players, there are ways around that. And one of the ways was mentioned in the chat, which is have the players do the math for you. Have the players roll the D20s, tell them to add a number to it, and they will give you everything that you need and probably be happy to do so in some cases. If you have players who get antsy while other people are taking their turns, let them do it. Let them run the monsters, right? You could literally do that. And players can have a great time doing that. So figure out exactly what these feelings are. And there are ways to mitigate or to eliminate the problem points in any game like that.
I think that in general RPGs, because a question that I get a lot when people are asking about, I want a GM, but I'm not sure. I don't know all the spells. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of the game, blah, 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 blah. That was not a dismiss their concerns, blah, 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 blah. That's just, those are often repeated. I think a lot of people kind of forget that it is a collaborative storytelling game, and that putting little, like you just said, Shawn, get them to do some of the math, track some monster health on the board. If that's the sort of game that you want to run, players are responsible for knowing their own spells in some capacity, and you don't need to have an encyclopedic knowledge if they know what it does. The cognitive load of the game can be shared with players a lot more than I think new GMs or even experienced GMs necessarily assume.
This intersects with a topic that was brought up in chat, which is about young players wanting to get into the game and not deal with a lot of heavy stuff. And I'm talking about like 8-year-old players as well. When it comes to learning games that are heavier than you need them for, right? There's sometimes a benefit to it. Learning to play D&D simply because it's immensely popular is not a bad thing, even if you don't play D&D. You don't play the rules to the hilt. Just like you said, Shawn, you can offload some of the mechanical, mental burden onto other players. You need not go play. I'm trying to think of a really, dirt simple fantasy game off the top of my head, and it's not coming to me. You don't need to go play an unpopular, but streamlined game just because of that. Sometimes just the process of, wading your way through something that is complex beyond your personal preference can be really good. It's kind of the way that people learn languages, I think, right? Is by dealing with stuff they don't know over and over and over again until their brain starts to pick up on patterns and it kind of gets brute forced into their mind.
I once got fired from a job for being bad at math.
Oh.
One of my first jobs, if possibly my first job ever, was working for a florist, just selling in like a market square sort of situation, selling flowers. But they had a really old register that you just typed. It didn't even have like what flower it was. You just typed the number. So you needed a good knowledge of how much every flower cost as well. Flowers are expensive, by the way, if you didn't know. And just like trying to figure out what like $17.30 plus X thing, was a nightmare to me at the time because I'm not good at like adding numbers under pressure on the fly. I can't deal in the States when you guys have to add tax to like, transactions. That just breaks my brain because I'm like, I have to add a percentage to this thing. It's already complicated enough. Give me a break. Anyway, all that to say, I was also quite intimidated by the math when starting to roleplay D&D. And I can say definitely just adding like damages together or subtracting monster health has made me a little bit better at math and figuring that stuff out on the fly. You get faster as you go, which you do in other areas as well. That's not to dismiss concerns about like being intimidated by math. There's been plenty of other great advice here in terms of offloading the load onto the players or playing games that are less mechanically heavy or less math heavy, if not mechanically heavy. But also, if it's a confidence issue more than anything, you can, I think your group will pull with you to kind of get through that, and you'll get quicker as you go, as you tend to get quicker at anything that you're slow at initially as you do more and more of it, like typing or, whatever. Next question that was emailed to James. What's the email address? What did they email? James, you're muted. That's an automatic F.
It's podcast@ghostfiregaming.com.
All right. Upgraded to a D-.
I passed.
This email coming in from Mick, who's asking, this is kind of similar to questions that we had a few weeks ago or a few months ago, but I still think slightly different and kind of a good partner conversation to the ones we had earlier about familiars. Should a familiar or animal companion be controlled by the player, fully controlled by the GM, or somewhere in between? Should familiars notice and therefore react when their summoner is repeatedly putting them in harm's way or using them flippantly or disposably? And to editorialize a little bit here, the rules of at least 5th edition D&D certainly describe how familiars just follow the command of the wizard or whoever, the druid who's controlling them. Same with the animal familiars. And so my experience has been there's a split role here, which is generally the assumption is the GM plays the personality, but the player chooses the actions, which I think leads to a bit of cognitive kind of dissonance where the GM starts to react how they think the animal companion would react to being constantly thrown in front of danger. That's been my experience. Before giving advice, what do you two think?
Let me reverse the question.
Okay.
Should minions of the big, bad, evil monster notice and therefore react when they're used repeatedly, putting them in harm's way and making them disposable? What's good for the player is good for the game master, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
It's about the narrative juice of it all, right? Like, is this the kind of game you're playing? Or is this the kind of story you're telling? Right? When we watch a movie or we read a book. Not to say that these are at all the same as playing a game, but as a narrative experience, if we have bits of realism engaging in the story, it also needs to serve the narrative function, right? It needs to be thematically coherent. Otherwise, we have a hard time making heads or tails of what's going on. History is interesting, but only because we synthesize history into a narrative. Or rather, it might be interesting either way, but it only flows when we synthesize it into a narrative and see where this story is taking us. This is why storytelling is such a powerful tool. You can make the facts fit the narrative by taking them in whatever combination you like to see. But because you're playing an RPG, you are in control of the facts. You can control what facts happen. And if the facts that are happening are, one of the themes that's arising from the game is people hate being mistreated by a more powerful force. If the minions of the big bad, if they do sort of cry and grovel whenever the lich orders these goblins to go do thine evil bidding, then it might be a really interesting narrative beat to suddenly show the ranger's animal companion whimpering in fear when being sent out to the front of the pack, right? That's not following the mechanics per se, but it's a narrative beat that suddenly draws comparison between the heroes and the villains. There's something narratively interesting there. But if you're just doing it because, this is what would happen in real life when an animal is put into danger, are we upholding the heroic genre anymore? Are we doing, like, if we're playing D&D, the name of the game is heroism, and that doesn't seem particularly heroic to me.
That's a great answer. My answer was similar in the sense that what's more important is the narrative and what's more important is consistency, unless it is to offset and contrast an important point like James just mentioned with the minions of the evil creature acting in the exact same way as the animal companions of the two rangers or two druids in the party as they are mistreated, then that's something. But what I see most often happening has nothing to do with the story, but it has to do with how these creatures are used and the game mechanical impact of them. So the game master will go through and the druid has the animal companion, the ranger has the animal companion, the paladin has the steed, and the wizard has the familiar, and everything's fine. And when they go through and they play it, all of a sudden everyone, or the game master usually realizes, there are basically 4 other characters here that are keeping me from using all the tools in my toolbox. Right? Now I can't spring a trap on these people because the wolf is walking ahead of the party all the time. The hawk is flying around looking for looking for ambushes. Behind us is the frog familiar who's hopping along to make sure nothing comes up behind them. I've had removed all these tools in my toolbox. So what's my one thing I can do? I can say, well, you're mistreating these creatures. Mm-hmm. Now, it wasn't the case before, but it's the case now because of the game mechanical elements that these creatures are filling in this adventure and in this system. So that's when we're going to bring this up. Not when it makes sense narratively to bring it up, but because I don't like the way they're being used now, which is, of course, a problem of the system, not a problem of the story.
I tend to be a little merciless with familiars if players are going to throw them around. Merciless, like if they've got the frog, hopping behind the party, well, I'm going to squish me that frog. They've got like 1 or 2 hit points each. It's not hard. Just take them out. I think there's a lot of especially when familiars start doing the help action thing where they just like fly up behind an enemy and they're like, I do the help action. I have no compunction about a villain wasting a turn or an attack to just reach up and squish that familiar and be like, all right, I'll help this. So this is my 2 cents. Yeah, I mean, as you've both said, whatever helps the narrative. I've had games where the person plays the wolf because it's kind of almost an extension of their own character. They're like, the wolf growls at you because they don't trust this NPC. And I'm like, okay, cool. Roll an insight check for yourself because you're go with advantage maybe or whatever. But they're role playing. Oh, the wolf's happy. It wags its tail in response to getting this, potion of healing or whatever. And that's entirely in their hands. And I think that makes it very clean when you have a companion that's personality kind of boils down to an animal element. When you have more intelligent familiars, maybe that gets a little bit more complicated. But for most animal familiars, I'm just like, you know what, you role play it, because it's your character, your familiar, you know them best. You have the connection between like a dog and its owner style thing. So you tell me what they do. But then I've had the flip side. One of the sorcerer subclasses in Grim Hollow gives you a spectre.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yep.
And the spectre, I love role playing the spectre because kind of like a warlock's a patron, the spectre can have a really antagonistic role with the character instead, and they're bound to do what the character tells them to do. But that's kind of the Marley from Christmas Carol, bound in chains, like cannot get away from the commands of the sorcerer, even in death. And so you create this kind of antagonistic relationship. But then it makes sense that the character can just throw them into danger because they're already dead and they just come back. So, mistreat them all you want. Who cares? And it works a lot better in that example, of just letting them be antagonistic with their familiars.
I sometimes get thrown by questions like this. I'm playing a Drake Warden Ranger in my current 5e game. And a big part of this character's arc is that the egg, the Drake started as an egg. And for the first 5 levels of play, my character was a druid. And then I reclassed as the egg hatched into Drake Warden. It was a huge character beat. Now that Drake is a sort of secondary half character, like you were talking about, that I play. And my character is really, really very protective of it. She has this very sort of maternal relationship to the hatchling. Whenever I hear questions like this, I'm reminded, oh yeah, there are players out there who don't think that way at all. And my design rarely takes that sort of thing into account because I don't try and like abuse proof my tabletop games. If I were designing an MMO or something, I would have to change my tune, right? I wouldn't. There's another great familiar story from old school World of Warcraft where hunters could use their animal companion to spread a boss mechanic of a plague, an infectious plague, into the overworld, and the thousands died. NPCs were corpseified all along every town in the Eastern Kingdoms. Crazy stuff. That's a sort of abuse that you need to prevent. But in an RPG, I think, I guess the main issue with not abuse-proofing the game is that all of a sudden it falls down to the GM to make decisions like this, isn't it? Now the GM has to be the one to address a deleterious playstyle. Do we think that the GM should be responsible for handling this sort of stuff, for finding out ways to squish down familiars when they get quote unquote abused?
I mean, it's a difficult issue from a game design perspective, right? Because the utility of the familiar, it is a class feature or a subclass feature. Therefore, it is a benefit to the player, needs to be, because the player is sacrificing whatever other subclass, whatever other class they could choose, and often they're getting less benefit because they've got, in some other area, because they've got a familiar. A beast, companion, ranger, whatever it's called, doesn't get the plus D8 to all its attacks because it has the familiar. And this is, I think, famously why the Beastmaster Ranger is so divisive, let's say, because it's so hard to design something that isn't useless, but also isn't so powerful you'd always want to take it, because there's an extra body on the battlefield. And yet we keep trying to, the Spectre Sorcerer, the Artificer with their homunculus, we'd love a companion. I want to do a fighter subclass that's a knight with a familiar, a squire, and that's your familiar, is like your squire who carries your helmet. So there is a difficulty there in this character is not your character per se, but they need to be under your control to be of benefit to you. And that leaves them open to abuse from a more powerful source, which naturally, if you want to extrapolate that out, can naturally lead into narratives of abuse against a less powerful creature or a less powerful person, because that's what the game is kind of setting up. So sure, GMs go wild with your embattered familiar narrative if you want to, because that's what the game seems to be encouraging if the player is not cognizant of being careful or conscious of their familiar's feelings. But should they be? Because a hunter ranger doesn't worry about how their arrows feel. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's kind of a game design problem within it.
In campaign 1 of Critical Role, Laura Bailey plays Vexalia, a ranger that was imported from Pathfinder, where all rangers had an animal companion. I don't remember if Vex was a Beastmaster or some other kind of ranger, but she kept her animal companion, the bear Trinket. And so Trinket was a bear that did not scale particularly well, numbers-wise, into high level. And after really the first arc of that campaign, I think maybe after the Briarwood arc, that bear would just give one shot. And Laura was terrified of having that bear get into combat because that was a crucial part of her character. And so, magic items were introduced to make it so that the bear could go back in like a Pokeball when it got KO'd and not die permanently. But this still feeds back into this idea that, it seems like there is a weird disconnect where pet rules seem to not really favor people who want to treat their pet callously as fodder, or people who want to treat the pet really kindly as a fellow friend. I think 5e 2024 is leaning in the latter direction, in the Vexalia direction, because they're all spirits now. They're not real animals. But the 2014 Beastmaster was a real animal, and it had rules for, getting a new one when it died.
I mean, I feel like and this is just my low fantasy brain kicking in, because, once you start to get into a space of like, they're all spirits and it's okay and we live in a magical fantasy land. I mean, yes, we do. We're playing a game. It is all a magical
Well, it does feel a little bit frictionless, though, doesn't it?
That's why the artificer, as we've described previously, is a balloon animal artist making magic items, because that's the easiest way mechanically. Like, writing the Trapper Monster Hunter subclass was really hard to capture a feeling of them not being a balloon animal artist and just kind of like pulling things out of midair, but actually tinkering with them. And I believe where we settled, or at least I remember saying this to people quite a few times within the playtest, was people were like, if you get downtime, you can have endless Trapper gadgets because you can just tinker them out as long as you've got endless gold to be able to make them. And I'm like, yes, as long as you've got endless gold. But the hope is that if you're actually using them and not stockpiling them, then just naturally through play, you will kind of use them and remake them and use them and remake them. And there's a little bit of trust going into how the GM's running the game, as opposed to placing these weird, arbitrary, it's all magic kind of limits on it that feel incongruous in dark fantasy. So they're like, they're all just animal spirits. It does solve the issue very quickly of like, don't worry, your familiar's not like it has maybe a personality if you want it to, but it's a spirit that's just going to go back to the Feywild or the Beastlands or wherever once it dies, like a Pokemon, as you said, James, going into a Pokeball. Don't worry about it. They don't feel hard done by. They believe in your cause. But that's an unsatisfying answer, I think. Yeah, it's just trying to, make the system sound plausible.
This is kind of a tangent. Sword Compass in chat. The 5e problem is that its action economy is per character. So if you're controlling 5 characters, you have 5 actions, bonus action, reaction, movement. If it were per player, it would work better. Allow me to shill Daggerheart for one more moment. Because this is a real advantage of its no turns system. It's an advantage of the spotlight shifting rather than everyone getting a turn. Is that, you say, I'm gonna take the spotlight. Or the GM is going to say, great, I'm going to react from that spotlight. It pings back and forth naturally so that your ranger's animal companion is just a part of your spotlight as a player rather than some kind of character-based turn order. All right. Shameless plug over. I just really like that game, and I want more people to play it. It's really, really good.
Somebody did say earlier as well, I apologize if I can't find their name again to read it out, but they mentioned how wouldn't it be better if familiars were kind of cosmetic and just there for role play, but the bonus they provide was kind of inherent to the character itself. So something like, and I'm just making this up off the top of my head, a wizard familiar doesn't fly around and attack things or whatever, but maybe it could let a wizard concentrate on 2 spells at once because the familiar can concentrate on a spell and the wizard can concentrate on a spell, and it's, you don't have to worry about where the familiar is, which I think is not a bad idea. I think to not chill for it in any way whatsoever, but just to mention, like, the Tau in Warhammer 40k have a lot of little drones that float around, and in previous editions of that game, they were like, warriors on the battlefield that could be targeted and attacked and stuff. And I believe in the 10th edition of the game, they're really just tokens that give bonuses to a unit, and they're there to look cool rather than to like directly be targeted or interact in any way. So I do like that idea in theory. I like little miniature tokens and things that you throw out next to your character that you don't have to dedicate brain space to. You're just like, yeah, there's my wolf, and it's cool. And I get advantage on every second attack on my turn because the wolf's there helping me, but I don't actually have to worry about where it is on the battlefield. I think that's potentially a good solution.
Right.
Not the way 5e is designed, but
it's a good solution until people don't want that solution because it's not as good as the other solution that was in this other game that, well, I remember in 3rd edition playing a druid, so I had an animal companion and I had 7 summoned fire elementals, and they each got a turn. And I'm playing 5th edition now, but boy, I love that feeling and I want that. And if that game doesn't give me that, this game sucks.
Yeah, I don't know if we answered the question here at all, but those are
this is the risk you take when you email the Eldritch Lorecast
at podcast@ghostfiregaming.
At podcast@ghostfiregaming.com.
At the risk of this episode being a little bit short again, I don't think we necessarily have time to jump into another email. Wah, wah. Anyway.
The number one podcast in all the realms.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why. You can catch the number one podcast in all the realms at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific on a Monday, starting next week. We are going to be an hour later because of daylight saving times changes here in Australia. Or it will be 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Time on a Tuesday. If you want to catch us live, come ask questions live in the chat. We will be here. We're also on YouTube. Likes and stars and thumbs and stuff. As I rub my eye. Likes and stars and thumbs and stuff. Likes and stars and thumbs and stuff. That's what we're going to go out on. My name's Dan Byrne. Here with James Haig, Shawn Merwin. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. We'll see you there. Likes and thumbs and stars and stuff. Likes and thumbs and stars and stuff. The chant gets more out of control each week.